names to avoid are Dave, Karen, Frank, Ray, Curtis, Brandon. I'll create all new names. I used to joke that the best decision I ever made was letting my wife pick where we retired. Turned out I was right, just not in the way I thought. My wife grew up in a small coastal town in Maine, not one of those tourist spots you see on postcards, all lobster shacks and sailboats. This was a real working town, the kind where families had lived for 4 or 5 generations, where the same last names showed up on the mailboxes, the church pews, and the cemetery headstones. Population maybe 800. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody knew your grandmother. We met in college in Boston. I was studying civil engineering. She was in business administration. Her name was Lydia. She had this calm, unhurried way about her that I found magnetic back then, like she always knew something you didn't. We dated for 3 years, got married at 26, settled in outside of Philadelphia where the work was good. We had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Both grown now, both living their own lives. 23 years of marriage. A good house. 2 cars that ran. Vacations we actually took. After our son left for college, Lydia started talking about Harwick. That was the name of her hometown. She'd been going back a few times a year her whole adult life to visit her mother, her aunt, her childhood friends. But now she started talking about it differently. Not visiting, living. I resisted at first. Philadelphia had been good to us. My clients were here, my friends were here. But Lydia made the case slowly and persistently, the way she did everything. Not with arguments, but with patience. She pointed out that I could consult remotely. She pointed out that the cost of living up there was a fraction of what we were paying. She pointed out that her mother wasn't getting any younger and that being closer mattered. She was right on all counts. We made the move 18 months before everything fell apart. Harwick was beautiful. I'll give it that. The harbor in the morning when the fog was still sitting on the water. The woods behind the house we bought from Lydia's cousin, a big colonial with a wraparound porch and an actual barn. Lydia's family had roots in that land going back to the 1800s. She settled in immediately, like she'd never left. She joined the Historical Preservation Committee, the Church Events Board, the Summer Festival Planning Group. She knew everyone and everyone knew her. I was the outsider, not in an unfriendly way. The people of Harwick were polite, some of them genuinely warm, but there was a particular kind of knowing between the longtime families that I wasn't part of, a shorthand that came from decades of shared history. I didn't mind it. I figured it would take time. About 6 months after we moved, I was doing what I always did on a Saturday afternoon when the weather turned gray, poking around the house looking for projects. The previous owners had left the attic mostly intact. Old furniture, cardboard boxes, soft with age, a few pieces of what might have been equipment from when the place was a working farm. I was moving things around looking for signs of water damage in the eaves when I found a wooden box under a folded wool blanket. Inside was a collection of papers, handwritten, the ink brown with age, the pages soft and fragile. On the first page, in careful cursive, Notes and Remembrances. Harwick, 1952. The author's name was Edna Marsh. Lydia's maiden name was Marsh. Lydia's maiden name was Marsh. I sat down on an old steamer trunk and started reading. The handwriting was elegant, but the content was strange. Edna wrote about Harwick's history the way you'd write a private confession, specific names, specific years, specific events. A lot of it was local color, the kind of thing you'd find in any small-town archive. But then she got to something she called the arrangement. She wrote about it matter-of-factly, the way you describe a seasonal tradition, a barn raising, a town meeting. The arrangement, as Edna described it, had roots in Harwick's founding families. When a young man from one of the old families came of age, she meant 18, sometimes 20. Certain married women of standing in the community would take on a role she called mentorship. She used that word carefully, but she was not subtle about what she meant. These were women who had been married long enough to have raised children, women whose own children were grown. The young men would come to help with the house or the land, splitting wood, repairing fences, and in exchange they would receive, as Edna put it, guidance in the ways of marriage. I sat with that for a long time. I told myself it was history, old New England strangeness from the 1950s, something that had died out with Edna's generation. I put the box back where I found it. I didn't say anything to Lydia. 3 weeks later was the Harwick Founders' Day Festival. It was a genuinely nice event. Food, music, a bonfire on the town green. I went with Lydia and her mother, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance who had lived in Harwick her entire life and who had never, in 3 years of knowing me, seemed entirely convinced I was good enough for her daughter. At some point in the evening, I went to get drinks and came back to find Lydia talking with a young man I hadn't seen before. He was maybe 19-20, dark hair, good-looking in a straightforward, uncomplicated way. When I walked up, Lydia introduced him as Owen Marsh, a distant cousin, she said, from one of the founding families. He was working as a handyman for a few of the older homes in town. He had a very formal handshake for someone his age, and he held eye contact with Lydia for slightly too long after she spoke. I didn't say anything. I handed Lydia her drink, and we moved on. But later that night, after we got home and Lydia was in the kitchen, I heard her on the phone. She spoke quietly. I wasn't eavesdropping, I just happened to be in the hallway. She was talking to her mother. I caught only pieces. Our back fence. Some work that needed doing. Owen's name. I thought about Edna's notes. I told myself I was being paranoid. The next morning I mentioned it casually over coffee. I said I'd heard her mention Owen, and that if we needed fence work done, I was happy to do it myself, or hire someone from the hardware store in town. Lydia looked at me for a moment, then said she'd just been thinking the back section was rotting, and Owen was reliable and affordable. Nothing in her voice changed. Nothing in her face changed. She asked if I wanted more coffee. I said sure. 2 months later, I had to make a trip to Portland for 3 days, a consulting job I'd been putting off. Lydia drove me to the ferry, kissed me on the cheek, told me to call when I landed. I called that first night from my hotel. She picked up immediately. We talked for almost an hour. She sounded exactly like herself. The second day, I was sitting in a conference room waiting for a meeting to start, half watching my phone when it hit me. The timing. I pulled up the photos on my phone and scrolled back to the spring. We'd had a section of fence replaced. I had photographs somewhere because I'd been documenting some work on the property for insurance purposes. I found them. The fence work had been done while I was in Boston for a week in March. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I called Lydia that evening and I asked her, just conversationally, if she remembered who had done that fence work in March. There was a pause. Small, maybe 2 seconds. But I had been married to this woman for 23 years, and I knew her pauses. She said Owen had done it. I asked what we paid him. She said she didn't remember exactly, that she paid in cash, that it was reasonable. I said okay. I didn't sleep well that night. In the morning I called and told her I was extending my Portland trip by a few days. She said she understood. She sounded worried. When I got back to Harwick, Constance was sitting in our living room. I asked Lydia why her mother was there. Lydia said she'd called her because she was concerned about me. That I'd been distant. That I didn't understand Harwick. That I'd never really tried to. I sat down across from both of them, and I said, I want to ask a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Is there such a thing as an arrangement in this town, among certain families, with young men? Is that a real thing? Constance didn't flinch. She said yes. She explained it the way you might explain the church potluck, as if the remarkable thing was that I needed it explained at all. The old families had done things their own way for generations. It wasn't an affair. It was a form of education, of community service. Young men needed guidance. Married women of experience provided it. It was discreet. It was brief. It had kept this community stable and close-knit for longer than I'd been alive. I looked at Lydia, and I asked her if she had been part of this with Owen. She looked at her mother. That was enough. Constance said that the families had a tradition of discretion and that I was reacting the way any outsider would. She said that if I had been from Harwick, I would understand that this was not a betrayal, it was a responsibility. She said that Lydia had done nothing wrong. I said I need to know if my wife slept with this young man while I was out of town. There was a long silence. Lydia said, It's not that simple. I said, actually, it's exactly that simple. Constance started talking again, about history, about community bonds, about the responsibility of old families to maintain their traditions. I let her talk. Then I said, Constance, you're a woman of standing in this community. Have you personally participated in this arrangement? She paused. Then she said yes. Several times. She said she was not ashamed of it. I said, So your husband Lloyd, he knows about this? Her expression shifted. Not much, but enough. She said that some things were understood between long-married couples. I said, or he doesn't know. She said, he trusts me. I said, that's not the same thing. Lydia put her hand on her mother's arm and told her maybe she should go home. Constance stood up and pointed at me and said that I would never truly belong here, that Lydia had made a sacrifice to marry an outsider, that this was the consequence. Then she left. Lydia cried most of that night. She said she was sorry. She said she should have told me. She said she'd done it because of the pressure from her mother, from the community, because she'd grown up being told this was just how things were done among the old families. She said she hadn't thought it would hurt me because she hadn't intended for me to find out. I sat in the armchair across the room and listened to all of it. When she was done, I said, that last part. The part where you didn't think it would hurt me because you didn't think I'd find out. That's not the same as it not being a betrayal. She didn't have an answer for that. The next few weeks were the strangest of my life. We were still in the same house. I was still sleeping in the spare room. We talked, but we talked carefully, like people navigating around something sharp on the floor. I went to see Lloyd Constance's husband, my father-in-law, who I had genuinely liked since the day I met him. He was a quiet man, a former fisherman, 67 years old, with big hands and a habit of squinting when he was thinking. We sat on his back porch and he poured me a glass of something from an unmarked bottle and he said, I figured this was coming. He told me that he had known about the arrangement for years. He'd found out the way I had. By accident, something overheard, something that didn't add up. He'd confronted Constance and she had explained it the same way she'd explained it to me. He had been furious. He had threatened to leave. Then life had continued and the years had gone by and he had never quite found the moment to actually go. He lifted his glass and said, I should have left. I want to be honest with you about that. I should have left, and I didn't, and it ate something out of me. I asked him if he knew about Lydia. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I knew it was possible. I hoped it hadn't happened. He looked at me steadily. He said, what are you going to do? I told him I didn't know yet. What made it worse, what made it specifically, precisely worse, was when I went back and asked Lydia directly, was Owen the first? She looked at the floor. I said, was he the first? She said there had been another young man 2 years before Owen. Before we moved to Harwick, during one of her visits. His name was Tyler, she said. He was related to the Marsh family on her mother's side. He had done some work on the property she used as a home base during those visits. She said it had felt like fulfilling something she owed, an obligation she'd been carrying since she left Harwick for college and never came back to participate in what her family expected of her. I said, so when you were pushing for us to move here, when you spent 2 years convincing me to come to Harwick, was this part of it? Was part of the reason you wanted to be here because you'd already started this and you wanted to be in a place where it was normal? She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, I wanted to come home. Both things were true. I left the room. I went for a walk. It was getting dark and the harbor was still and the air smelled like pine and salt, and I thought about 23 years, and I thought about how you build a life with someone and how you never actually see all of it. How there are rooms inside another person you never open. I had thought I knew Lydia. Not perfectly. No one knows anyone perfectly. But well, I had thought I knew the dimensions of who she was. It turned out I'd been living in a wing of the house while other rooms existed behind doors I hadn't known were there. I walked back through town. Coming around the side street near the post office, I nearly ran into a woman named Georgia Aldrich. She was about 60, a widow, one of the town's librarians, someone I'd chatted with a few times at community events. She was one of the few people in Harwick who had always treated me like I already belonged, without making it a point. She took one look at my face and said, walk with me a minute. We sat on a bench near the harbor and I told her everything. I don't know why. Maybe because she'd always been straightforward with me, or maybe because I just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't Lydia or Constance or Lloyd. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a bit. Then she said, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly. This tradition, or what it's become, it's not what the women in it claim it is. It started as something real, maybe a long time ago. What it is now is a small group of women in certain families who have convinced themselves and each other that their appetites are a cultural obligation. I've lived here my whole life and I've watched it. I'm not part of it and I never was. Most women in this town aren't. I said, Constance told Lydia it was her duty. Georgia said, Constance has been doing this for 30 years, and she needed a story that made it a duty instead of a choice. I sat with that. Georgia looked at me and said, What do you want to do? Not what do you have to do. What do you actually want? I said, I want Lydia to understand what this cost. I don't think she does. I think she's sorry she got caught, and I think she's sorry I'm hurt, but I don't think she understands what it actually cost. Georgia nodded slowly. She said, Constance told half this town she was speaking on your behalf in some capacity when she clearly was not. I said, What do you mean? She said, She's been telling people that you and she had a conversation in which you came to understand the tradition and were willing to work through it. She's been managing the narrative. I heard it from Margaret Putnam at the library yesterday. I let that sit for a moment, then something settled in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. I went home. Lydia was in the kitchen. I told her I needed to take a week at my brother's place in Vermont to think. She asked if she could come. I said no. I said I'd be in touch. I drove to Vermont. I spent 3 days hiking and being mostly quiet and thinking. By the 4th day, I knew what I needed to do, and by the 5th day, I'd made some calls. I came back to Harwick not to reconcile and not to leave quietly. I came back because there was something I needed to finish first. I went to see Lloyd again. I told him what Constance had been telling people around town, that she'd told them I'd accepted the situation. He listened with that particular stillness of his, and then he set down his coffee cup and said, I'm done. I went to the next town committee meeting, the Historical Preservation Committee that Constance chaired, the one Lydia sat on. There were about 20 people there. I sat down. When the meeting opened for general comments, I stood up and I said, clearly and without raising my voice, that I wanted to address a specific piece of misinformation that had been circulating. I said that Constance Marsh had been telling community members that I had accepted certain arrangements in this town on behalf of my marriage. I said that was false. I said that I had not accepted anything. I said that I was filing for divorce. Constance stood up. She said I had no right to air private family matters in a public forum. I said that she had already aired them. She'd just been selective about which version she shared. Lydia didn't say anything. She sat very still with her hands in her lap. Lloyd, who had come in quietly and sat in the back, stood up and said, I've filed papers too, Constance. Thought you should know. The room went very quiet. I drove back to the house and I packed what I needed. I'd already made arrangements. I'd been renting a small place in the next town over starting the following week. I'd called a realtor. I'd called my attorney. I'd done the methodical, quiet work of disentangling a life. Before I left, I walked out to the back of the property, past the section of fence that Owen had replaced while I was out of town. It was solid work, I'll give him that. The posts were well set, the boards straight. I stood there for a minute looking at it. Then I got in my truck. I want to say there was a dramatic gesture, something satisfying, but mostly there was just the weight of things. 23 years, 2 kids, a house. The particular specific sadness of realizing that someone you loved had been making choices inside your shared life that you were never part of. That's the thing no one tells you about betrayal. It's not loud. It's the silence where the trust used to be. You walk through the rooms of a life you thought you understood, and you realize the walls are different than you thought. The foundation is something other than what you were told. The divorce took 7 months. Lydia didn't contest much. I think she was ashamed, genuinely, in a way that Constance never was. She called me once during the process and said she knew an apology wasn't enough, and she was right. I didn't hang up on her. I listened. I said I knew she hadn't set out to hurt me. I said that wasn't actually the point. The house sold quickly. Lydia kept her community connections in Harwick, or tried to. Lloyd and Constance's divorce became a different kind of scandal, a louder one, because Lloyd talked about it with the directness of a man who'd been swallowing something for 30 years and was finally done. The arrangement, as the old families called it, mostly stopped being discussed openly after that. Georgia told me it had gone underground rather than disappearing, but that several of the younger families had walked away from it entirely, and that a number of women who'd been pressured into it over the years had started talking to each other in ways they hadn't before. I rent a place in Portland now, close enough to Vermont to see my son on weekends, close enough to Boston to work. It's smaller than anything I've lived in since my 20s, and I like it more than I expected to. I run in the mornings, I cook badly. I have learned, late in life, that a quiet life you actually own is worth more than a beautiful life built on someone else's terms. Georgia still emails me once in a while. She sent me a photograph last fall. The harbor at Harwick on a November morning, fog on the water, the old pier. It's beautiful in the way the complicated things are beautiful. I look at it sometimes. I don't write back with much. But I always write back. I've thought a lot about the sequence of events that led to that committee meeting, the one where I stood up and said out loud, in front of 20 people, that I was filing for divorce. And what I keep coming back to is this. Every single thing that happened was a direct result of choices. Not fate, not circumstance, not bad luck. Choices made by specific people who then had to live with what those choices built. Constance chose to maintain a lie for 30 years, and she chose to manage the narrative when it started unraveling. And she chose to tell people in Harwick that I had accepted something I had never accepted. Each of those choices stacked on top of the last one, the way a poorly built wall stacks, it holds for a while, and then one day it doesn't. Lloyd sitting in the back of that room and saying, "I filed papers too," that was 30 years of swallowed truth, finally finding a way out. Constance built that outcome herself, one small dishonesty at a time. Lydia chose to keep a secret inside a marriage that was supposed to have no locked rooms. She chose to convince herself that because she hadn't intended for me to find out, the harm didn't exist until I knew about it. That's not how harm works. A crack in a foundation doesn't wait for you to notice it before it starts spreading. What I had to reckon with, and this took me longer than I want to admit, was my own part in it. Not in what Lydia did, but in the years leading up to it. I had let her lead on every major decision about where we lived and how we lived, because it was easier than negotiating, because I trusted her completely, because I believed that trust was the same thing as paying attention. It wasn't. Trust without attention is just assumption wearing a more comfortable name. I had assumed a version of Lydia that was simpler than the actual person, and when the actual person turned out to be more complicated, I had to acknowledge that I had chosen not to look too closely. That's not self-blame, it's just honest accounting. What Georgia gave me, sitting on that bench by the harbor, was something I didn't know I needed, a clear-eyed witness. Someone who had watched this community for decades and could tell me what was real and what was story. She didn't tell me what to do. She asked me what I actually wanted. That question cracked something open. I had spent weeks asking what I was supposed to do, what was fair, what I could live with. Nobody had asked me what I wanted. The answer, when I finally let myself hear it, was simple. I wanted to live in a life that was actually mine. That's what I have now. It's smaller than what I had. It's quieter. There are mornings in my Portland apartment when I make coffee and look out at the street and feel the specific weight of starting over at 51, and it's not nothing. That weight. But underneath it is something I hadn't felt in years. A kind of solid ground. The ground that comes from knowing that everything in your life is actually yours, that there's no room in your house whose door you've agreed not to open. Integrity isn't something you declare. It's what's left after everything that wasn't real has been cleared away. Lydia lost herself in the space between what she told me and what was true. I found myself in the same space, on the other side of it. That's the whole story. It cost everything it cost. I wouldn't undo knowing it.